Hold on tight for the next hour. You're entering into a place, a zone called the alternative to the alternative media. It's a place, a special place where even truth seekers fear to tread.
All right, people, let's move like we've got a purpose.
Affirmative.
Okay, Greg Anthony here, and welcome back to the Investigative Journal on this January 26th, 2017 day on our calendar. And before I get to my Jesuit quote of the day, as well as my opening monologue, let me say that I'm going to deal with the subject of how the Vatican created Islam, and also the Trump tornado, and how these relate. But first, my Jesuit quote of the day. I've given you this quote before, but let me do it again. French General Marquis de Lafayette, who served in the American Continental Army under the command of General George Washington during the American Revolutionary War, was a devout Roman Catholic. But he stated this, quote, "It is my opinion that if the liberties of this country, the United States of America, are destroyed, it will be by the subtlety of the Roman Catholic Jesuit priests, for they are the most crafty, dangerous enemies to civil and religious liberty. They have instigated and incited most of the wars of Europe." Wow. Now, I've given that quote out a number of times over the years, and I always wondered, if he was a Roman Catholic, a devout Roman Catholic, why was he coming down so hard on the Jesuits? And perhaps more, some of you historians out there who want to deal with real history have an insight on that. Let me know at gregbeacon@gmail.com, because I found that very interesting. I also find interesting, once you start going over all these quotes over the years, over the hundreds of years, stating the same thing that Lafayette said with much more meat and potatoes to it, meaning that they're talking about the number of countries that the Jesuits have been thrown out of, and the numerous things regarding how they instigate and incite and infiltrate for their own benefits. But it seems like the big shots, these big leaders, talked about it years ago, even up until, I believe it, even up until the mid-1900s, like 1930, 1940. But you don't hear anything anymore from our leaders. It's kind of a subject that is taboo, isn't it? It's a taboo subject. And, there's an old saying that states that the devil's greatest achievement was to persuade humanity that he didn't exist. And so really, in reality, this well-constructed wall that conceals the real puppet masters, the Vatican Jesuits, is basically in the same vein, isn't it? We hear information all the time about the Illuminati, is the Bilderbergers, the Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations, to name a few. But isn't this just a cover, a layer of the onion that is protecting the real people that we need to talk about? And all these people, in the course of history, that spoke about it in the past, seem to have been forgotten about. So think about that for a while, and let me get on to my opening monologue. People of the world have grave differences, but what is one common denominator we never seem to talk about? What is our shared inevitable destination for every person that's ever walked the face of the earth? Of course, death is our common denominator. But how we handle it varies widely from country to country, from community to community. Did you realize that some 2.6 million people die each year in the United States? And that number, folks, will increase rapidly as the baby boomer generation, a huge generation, approaches the end of their lives. Now, how do we deal with mourning? How do we remember what influenced us throughout our life regarding death? I think it's a lot to do with our religious backgrounds, etc., etc. Now, I always said that the easiest death to deal with will be your own. And when death comes knocking at your doorstep, it's particularly difficult when it takes your loved ones. Now, recently, I lost a very good friend, and we've talked about it many times, Miss Moose, a dog I've had for over 14 years. Now, since I've dealt with that, it's been 2 weeks. I've met many people out on the streets that know me, and they've consoled me over it and understand that a pet, a dog, has a purpose. I believe every creature has a purpose. And they realize, because they've seen me for years, and I've been given so many accolades, boy, you're always with them. You take such good care of them. And I appreciated everything that those people did. But you know, folks, death is no stranger to me on taking loved ones. When I was a 10-year-old boy, my mother died of leukemia. And the first thing I did when I was, back then, we were told to go to the funerals, which lasted 3 days, and you would see the body in the casket. And I remember the first day when I walked in there, I looked at my mother, couldn't believe she was just laying there still, and I ran out. I ran away from it. And I ended up about 6 blocks away at a local fast food place, stuffing my face with hamburgers. My good friend and my Uncle Chester, who has also passed on, came to console me, and I never did go back into that funeral home. Now, as life went on, I remember losing a baby, a child in childbirth, to my first wife. We then broke up about 4 or 5 years later. I believe over that subject. We tried to have children, but never could. And so as the years went on, I became very callous to death. I ran away from it all the time. And wasn't it interesting? And I have to tell you this, the other day, the day after Miss Moose passed away, I have another dog that was named Max, who you all know about, who's been in the movies, etc., a big Malamute who's been my friend for 9 years, 10 years. He knew nothing else but her. And that night we sat around, and I had the door open, and if you don't know, I live on a boat. And he went running through the door, jumped off the boat, and kept running on the docks till I found him, and he went out looking for her, I believe. So me and him have a lot in common on how we deal with it, how we run away from it. And as I said, well, let's ask Mark Twain what he thought. I remember Mark Twain when he passed away. He'd suffered so many losses, nothing worse than outliving your children, outliving your loved ones, outliving all your friends. And as Mark Twain lay on his deathbed, he said one thing: I think it's time to go because I have nobody to play with anymore. And so that's an interesting look at death. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because as life goes on, I've heard many analogies to death. For example, when I was looking into Christianity, I was an atheist at a time. And I was looking into Christianity, and I would talk to born-again Christians, and they would tell me that becoming a born-again Christian, your old self dies, and you become a new person. And so basically what they were saying is your old self dies, and a new person comes and lives. So there is a similarity there, dealing with the death of your old self and seeing your new self born again. Now also, when as a journalist I dealt doing many stories sometimes on the homeless, drug addicts, alcoholics, and as I talked to recovering alcoholics or drug addicts, the one thing they told me was that once they beat their addiction, guess what happens? Their old self dies, and a new person is born, someone they didn't know. And so there's a similarity there, death in while living. And the question I have, and the reason I'm doing this opening monologue, to lead into my subject matter of the day, is that I believe the same thing happens when your old belief systems die and you actually become a new person, not only in the spiritual world or not only with your self-imposed addictions, but with the way you function in life, with the way you function with your government, the way you function with the people around you. And the only way those old belief systems that lead you into the devil's den, because remember, this world wasn't made for God's people. And the more and more you begin to research what's going on in the world, the more you see really where it all comes from. And so when you decide to say things like the Vatican-led New World Order, the Jesuits are behind this stuff, you better back it up with facts, which I've tried to do. And secondly, when you say the Vatican created Islam, you better back it up with facts and not just conjecture. Now, you're never going to get the information out in the mainstream, at least now. But the point is, internally, you become a new person. You see the world through a different lens, and in fact, your old self dies, and you view the world completely different, bringing everything together now between the secular world and the spiritual world. So my question to you is, we deal with death in so many different ways, and it is up to us to become that new person, to basically be born again, even while we're on this earth, and when we leave this earth, we are born again as well. Okay, so let's get to our main subject. Did the Vatican create Islam? I've discussed this many times, but I always think it's important to do it again when the time permits. Now, this subject, if you say the Vatican created Islam, will meet much pushback. Oops, I owe $20. I used that word. Remember the show I did where I laid out about 10 words that should never be used on this show? Now I got to put that $20 into that category. Okay, so anyway, not many people are going to listen to it. And the information we get on this is very scarce, and that's because the Jesuits have controlled history and what we read in our history books. But there was a priest, a Jesuit priest, who defected and told the story, and so we rely much on what he says. And there are others that make the connection quite well, one being Walter Weiss, does much research on it, and I recommend you go to many of his videos called the Islamic Vatican Connection, etc. But let's concentrate right now on this subject through the eyes of the Jesuit priest, Father Alberto Rivera, and he says how the Vatican created Islam. I say it's an astonishing story, and from this Jesuit priest, which was told to him by Cardinal Bea while he was at the Vatican. Now, many people will say, well, Alberto Rivera is not alive. Yes, I know he's not alive. He was killed by the Jesuits, and I had an opportunity to interview his wife, Nuri. So I'm quite sure that what he's talking about is the truth. And so let's look at what he says. Now, this question of the Vatican creating Islam brings us to what's happening today in Islam, because there was a huge war even back during the 600s which wiped out a lot of Christianity. So what is the similarity today? Christians are being persecuted all over the world, aren't they? We discussed that 2 days ago on our show, didn't we? And so if we want to get to the origins of why this is happening, beyond what we hear from our presidential candidates and from the world, we basically have to start, killing that belief system and creating a new one. So let's look at what Father Alberto Rivera had to say regarding this subject. It's quite interesting. And I find if we do that, we are a lot better off. And he said this. He said, what I'm going to tell you is quite interesting. And I've lost the little, I lost the little clip I had, a little glitch here in the internet. So just 1 second. Okay, he said this. What I'm going to tell you is what I learned in secret briefings in the Vatican when I was a Jesuit priest. A Jesuit cardinal named Augustine Bea showed us desperately the Roman Catholics wanted Jerusalem at the end of the 3rd century. Because of the religious history and the strategic location of the holy city was considered a priceless treasure, a scheme had to be developed to make Jerusalem a Roman Catholic city. The great untapped source of manpower that could do this job was the children of Ishmael. The poor Arabs fell victim to one of the most clever plans ever devised. Interesting. Early Christians went everywhere with the gospel, setting up small churches, but they met heavy opposition. Both the Jews and the Roman government persecuted the believers in Christ to stop their spread. This was going on way back when, folks. Very similar to what's happening today, right? But the Jews rebelled against Rome, and in 70 AD, Roman armies under General Titus smashed Jerusalem and destroyed the great Jewish temple, which was the heart of the Jewish worship, in fulfillment of Christ's prophecy in Matthew 24:2. All right, just bear with me. Sometimes it's good to go back in history, isn't it? Now, on this holy land today, where the temple once stood, the Dome of the Rock Mosque stands as Islam's second most holy place. Corruption, apathy, greed, cruelty, perversion, and rebellion were eating at the Roman Empire at this time, and it was ready to collapse. The persecution against Christians was useless, as they continued to lay down their lives for the gospel of Christ. The only way Satan could stop this thrust was to create a counterfeit Christian religion to destroy the work of God. The solution was in Rome. Their religion had come from the ancient Babylon, and all it needed was a facelift. It didn't happen overnight, but began in the writings of the early church fathers. So basically, you're seeing this mesh of paganism and Christianity. It was through their writings that a new religion would take shape. The statue of Jupiter in Rome was eventually called St. Peter, and the statue of Venus was changed to the Virgin Mary. Now, the site chosen for its headquarters was one of the 7 hills called Vaticanus, the place of the diving serpent, right now where the Vatican stands, on pagan ground. The great counterfeit religion was Roman Catholicism, called mystery religion of the great, the mother of all harlots, the abomination of the earth in Revelations 17:5. She was raised up to block the gospel, slaughter the believers in Christ, establish religions, create wars, and make the nations drunk with the wine of the fornication, as we will see. And isn't that going on today? If you look at what's going on in Nigeria, look what's going on here, the persecution, the getting rid of God in the Bible. 3 major religions have one thing in common. Each has a holy place where they look for guidance. What are these 3 religions? Roman Catholicism looks to the Vatican as the holy city, right? I was there for years, I know that for a fact. The Jews look to the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. And the Muslims look to Mecca as their holy city. Each group believes that they receive certain types of blessings for the rest of their lives for visiting their holy place. In the beginning, Arab visitors would bring gifts to the house of God, and the keepers of the Kaaba were gracious to all who came. Some brought their idols, and not wanting to offend these people, these idols were even brought. Interesting. It is said that Jews looked upon the Kaaba as an outlying tabernacle of the Lord with veneration until it became polluted with idols. In a tribal contention over a well, Zaman, the treasure of the Kaaba and the blessings and the offerings that pilgrims had given were dumped down the well. Interesting. Many years later, an Arab, a high Arab, was given visions telling him where to find the well and its treasure. He became the hero of Mecca, and he was destined to become the grandfather of all of Muhammad. Interesting. Okay, you know, we're getting deep into history here, and bear with me, because we do have a plan, a message here, and that is to show you how the Vatican created Islam. Okay, and we'll continue in a second. Okay, I've got about 4 minutes on this side of the break, and I just wanted to set up a show that, you know, this show I've done, this information I've brought to you before on other shows, and I'm not going to go through every little piece of this. I just want to make a synopsis of what the statement I made that the Vatican created Islam. When you look at all the connections between Muhammad and what their goal was back then, you will find that the same thing is happening today, using Islam as a weapon to destroy Christianity or the West. Isn't that their goal today? And they did the same thing in Africa back then. So I refer you to a number of different. You can Google. You can Google. Alberto Rivera, the Roman Catholic and Islamic connection, etc., etc., and find much on this subject. So I won't go through it. I got about 2 minutes here, and what I want to do in the next half hour, I found a lot of information regarding the history during this time, showing you even more of the similarities of what was going back. What was going on back then and what is going on today. And I thought that would be interesting to bring you a lot of the historical facts. Hopefully it won't bore you. But it's also good to get it on the record that history, we always say history repeats itself. Well, this time we can categorically say this creation of ISIS and all of what's happening is exactly repeating itself. In the second half hour, I'm going to start out with what I talked about, a little bit on the Trump tornado, and then give you some historical facts that show you that there is a high probability. And I would almost say, if you really start researching this, the Vatican did create Islam for a reason back then, and they're using the same tool to destroy Christianity, this time in the West, here, as they did when they did it in Africa and the East. And it's an interesting look anyway. And what also tells me this could be the truth, and I want you to research it for yourself, of course, is that it's hidden. There's so many facts. Why don't people lay out this stuff? If really the historians that control the educational systems, why don't you just lay these facts out and let people decide? And the reason is people would probably come to the same conclusion I have. And in a sense, to end what I started, when you start looking this way, your old belief system about the government, about the religion you grew up in, dies. And you become a new person. They don't want that. You become a thinking person, a person that's not afraid to speak out. And they want just good, obedient workers, somebody who only listened to them. And so in a sense, that part of you dies and a new person is born, and they don't want that. That would destroy the devil's and the Vatican's plan of a one-world government, one-world order. And we will be back in 3 minutes on the Investigative Journal.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
The book of Revelation says, "The spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ." This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today, so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit DiscountGoldandSilverTrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit DiscountGoldandSilverTrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.
The following program is labeled dangerous and off limits by the supreme Jesuit command. But stand tall, people. Listen up, and you may just learn something.
Oh, dear Lord Jesus, this ain't happening, man. This can't be happening, man. This isn't happening.
Okay, back for the second half hour, and before I get back to the Vatican and Islam, let me talk about this Trump tornado, which is blowing all across America, creating shockwaves both on the left and the right. It's an incredible display of one person, a president, keeping his promises in just 4 or 5 short days. I really have never seen anything like it since I started following the political landscape as a young news reporter working for the Naples Daily News. Had an opportunity to see many presidents come and go, and many situations arise in this country, much turmoil, and how problems have been solved one way or the other. But I've never seen anything quite like this. It was my contention that the Obama administration, as well as the Bush administration, had its sights set on destroying this country. Not only, I can't think of anything that Obama did, whether it be foreign or domestic, that didn't place the rest of the world in a better position and really didn't look out for the American people whatsoever. And as a parting shot over the bow, when Obama left office on that Friday, he was a president till Trump was sworn in at 12 o'clock, just hours before he left. He sent $221 million to the Palestinian people. Now, you know, it's not going to go to the good people. It's going to go to terrorism. He did the same thing when he created this Iran nuclear deal, and in the dead of night sent $1.2 billion in cold hard cash in all different denominations on a plane to the Iranians. He also, along with that nuclear deal, which is a sham, gave them $150 million. This is incredible. And where's that money going to go to? It's going to go to terrorism. And at the same time, he has basically looked at our allies, whether it be in England or whether it be Israel or whatever, as more or less enemies. And our enemies are friends. And his policy of putting America second has nothing more than not only hurt the American worker, the American people. Do you realize 70,000 factories have left this country since NAFTA was formed with the Clinton administration? And so now you see Trump, and not to mention the immigration problem, sanctuary cities which allow illegal aliens to stay in this country. They're not reported to ICE and to the feds. I mean, there's a whole situation going here where there's an influx of all these, a weakening of America. The American military is being weakened. Now, secondly, this election brought in Trump. Now, the only similarity the closest president I can find that's similar to Donald Trump is Andrew Jackson, the people's president. And he basically changed the course and history of America if you look back at Andrew Jackson. And I think Trump is in the same vein. Now, where this goes, only God knows. But it's refreshing to see America being put first. And every one of the things I mentioned, Trump basically is dealing with in his first 5 days. He's presented executive order after executive order, claiming to, cracking down on immigration. He's going to build the wall, and Mexico is going to pay for it. And one after the other, the promises, just in 5 days, he's living up to. And I don't think it's going to be any different for this 4 years. Now, biggest deal he's doing is trade. He wants to get rid of NAFTA, TPP, the Pacific Partnership, and unwind all these deals that seem to put America second. For example, when you have NAFTA, we're losing $60 billion a year in a trade deficit to Mexico. And so to get that money to build the wall isn't going to be difficult if he decides to renegotiate, and he said he is, NAFTA individually. Now, as we speak, Theresa May, the Prime Minister of England, will be here meeting with Trump, and you're going to see America and England deal bilaterally in trade. And again, 2/3 of this, what I call the Holy Trinity, excluding the Vatican, are meeting tomorrow. And it'll be interesting to note that Brexit, meaning England wants their independence from the EU, America now wanting its independence, giving the government back to the people, so to speak, is a common thread. Now, you can go and just Google all of Trump's all of his actions in the 5 days he's taken over, and you will see it's completely opposite than Obama. So, the question is, where does this all lead us? Now, if we add the component that there is a hidden hand, there is somebody behind the scenes orchestrating these efforts for a reason, let's just surmise this and take it one step farther. Could it be that the battle lines are being drawn? The West and the typical partners, Israel, America, England, are being put in one side, and we see China, wherever Russia falls in, Russia, North Korea, and all the battle lines being drawn for a major conflict. Could it be sparked over trade? Could it be sparked over, anything? It's kind of interesting if you understand that now we have this whole Islamic powder keg that's openly said we want to destroy the West. How is that going to play out? So we have a lot of things happening here that lead me to believe that a conflict is on the horizon. When that comes, where and how, we can all just speculate. Okay, in the last 20 minutes here, let's get back to the Vatican and Islam, which has a lot to do with ISIS and what's happening today. Seeing this same radical Islamic idea to basically take the whole world and turn us into Muslims is really what they want. A hardline Muslim rule, and you can see that in the countries where they have 20 to 50 to 70 to 80% of the population. Not a very nice place to live. Let me refer to something I found on a site called Reformation.com, and it starts out by giving this quote from Joel 2:3, not Billy Joel, but Joel in the Bible. Fire devours before them, and behind them a flame burns. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them, but behind them a desolate wilderness, and nothing escapes them. Now, the people that wrote this said that this scripture is describing the Muslim invasion and destruction of North Africa. This happened a long time ago, folks, and it plays into, like I told you, this idea of why was Islam created at the time it was. Well, by 300 AD, this was probably 300 years before Islam as we know it today was created. By 300 AD, North Africa was the most important province of the Roman Empire and was teeming with cities, huge cities all over the place. We don't realize that. By the 3rd century, there were 500 or 600 cities. 200 of them were in the rich farmlands of northern Tunisia. In places there were no more than 6 or 8 miles apart, and in the valley of the river of Bagades, there was almost a kind of ribbon development along the main road of Carthage to Tebessa. Now that came from a book called Rome in Africa from page 101. Now Carthage was the second largest city in the Western Roman Empire, and was the center of the Roman province of Africa and a major breadbasket of the empire. Christian North Africa had millions of Christians, and Carthage was the most important city with a population of over 500,000. Now, by 300 AD, Christianity was the dominant, do you realize this? The dominant religion in North Africa, as paganism was just about to be completely overthrown there. Now, naturally, the Roman emperors were definitely jealous, wanted to get rid of this, that more and more people were not worshiping them as the divinities, right? Now, you have to understand, folks, that the Roman Catholicism is nothing more than the Roman Empire morphed into modern-day Catholicism. And if you look at their canon law, if you look at the way they've set up the College of Cardinals and everything, it's all set up basically as the Roman Empire was set up. So in 303, the last great empire-wide pagan persecution began, and North Africa Christians were ordered to hand over the scriptures to be burned. The last pagan persecution was in the planning stage for at least 40 years prior to 300 AD, as a very friendly ecumenical mood prevailed among the pagans. Now, the main target of the pagans in the Roman Empire was the New Covenant and the histories of Christ. All of the great books portraying the Mount of Olives and the site of the resurrection were systematically destroyed. Roman emperors, 2 of them, ordered all of the Christians in North Africa to hand over the scriptures for burning. They were also ordered to burn incense to the statues of the Caesars. Many refused to give up the scriptures and worship Caesar, so Christian blood flowed like a river through this area. And British-born Emperor Constantine began his career of conquest from York, England. Interesting. The last great persecution ended with Constantine became Emperor of the West. Together with Emperor Licinius, he issued an edict of toleration called the Edict of Milan. This Edict of Toleration did not apply to Christians who would not join this imperial Christianity. The edict excluded many of the North African survivors of the persecution. Those surviving Christians referred to people who handed over the scriptures as traitors and insisted on their rebaptism. Now, Constantine presided over the Council of Nicaea in 325. He condemned the surviving Christians in North Africa because they refused to join his new Christian Roman Empire. From then on, North African Christians were called Donatists, after the popular Christian leader named Donatus. All right, so the North Africa Christians were first condemned at the Council of Aries for rebaptizing those who handed over the scriptures during the persecution. Later, they were also condemned by Emperor Constantine at the Council of Nicaea. So we have a lot of interesting information building up to the final creation of Muhammad and Islam right before our eyes in 300 years or so before this actually occurred. Okay, I don't know about you, but I want to thank these people for bringing this information, because very little is heard about a man by the name of Donatus Magnus. He lived from 273 to 355. And history tells us he was a great Christian leader who ordered the rebaptism of traitors who turned over the Holy Scriptures to the pagan magistrates. He was basically considered like the St. Martin Luther of North Africa back then. But you know, history has covered him up. Very little is known about this remarkable guy. And I guess we have to just research it more and look up the Donatist, Donatis Church, and you'll find some interesting information. But many of the bishops who attended that Council of Nicaea were traitors. And Donatus knew this, and he demanded that they be rebaptized before admittance to the Christian congregation. So he was standing in the way of Constantine. And Constantine, he was furious that anybody would, not back him, and actually contemplated invading North Africa with his legions back then. But from that point on, the Vatican referred to Christians of North Africa as Donatists. I didn't know that. It's hidden. We see this again at the time of the Reformation, though, don't we? When the Reformed Christians were called Lutherans or Protestants instead of converted Catholic Christians. And isn't it interesting today that Catholicism calls itself Christianity when it isn't at all? Never was, never will be. Now, what about Augustine? St. Augustine. When I grew up as a kid, I heard so much about St. Augustine. There's even schools. Isn't there on St. Augustine, Florida or something? Anyway, I'm off track today. Augustine was appointed bishop to destroy North African Christians. I didn't hear that when I was in grade school. Despite the terrible persecution under the emperors, Christianity was rapidly growing and recovering in North Africa. So Augustine, now why did they name him a saint if he was to destroy Christians? So Augustine was appointed a bishop in the Hippo Regius region to fight them with pen and ink. So he was a prolific writer. His main job was to convince the survivors of the Diocletian persecution to join the Church of Rome. He was derisively referred to the northern African Christians as Donatists. Even though the North African Christians claimed to be true Catholics, Augustine derisively referred to them as Donatists. Augustine had an intense hatred for those uncompromising Christians who refused to join the Constantine Church. Now, every trick in the Roman arsenal was used to make the Christians conform, but most of them remained steadfast adherents of apostolic Christianity. Now, despite the multiplicity of words written against them, the Christians still held steadfast to the scriptures of the Lord and kept adding to his African congregation. Now, look what's going on today. On my show just the other day, we talked about how 60 to 70 million Christians are being surrounded by Muslim leaders in Nigeria and other parts of Africa. And as Attorney John Levy said, who's representing some of these groups, they're there for the slaughter, and nobody in this country is saying a word about it. Now, looking back, Augustine, remember, he referred to these North African Christians as Donatists. Many of his writings are locked up in the archives of the secret Vatican. That's why we got to get in there. Boy, could we learn a lot. And the reason they won't let us in is they don't want us to know all these things. He should be considered, really, who should be considered the real father of Islam? St. Augustine. He was the most powerful and influential teacher of the church at the time. He was the originator of false doctrines that emerged from that church, can be traced right back to him. Some of the false doctrines include original sin, purgatory, clerical celibacy, predestination, etc., etc. Augustine also laid the groundwork for the use disguised mercenaries of the age-long Vatican War against the saints. Some of these disguised mercenaries include many of these. I don't have the list right here. Now, Pope Gregory I sought one of the emperor's help against North African Christians. Despite all the efforts of Augustine, the Christian faith continued to grow, and Pope Gregory I was alarmed at its increase. By the time of Pope Gregory I, the Christians of North Africa continued to multiply. Now they were losing their power. The Pope was alarmed, and despite their bitter rivalry, he asked Emperor Mauritius for military help. Here's a quote from the Donatist Church. Okay. By 596, the situation had become even less favorable. A further letter from the Pope to Columbus, not Christopher, repeats the story of the spread of Donatism, or Christianity. But in August, Gregory wrote to Emperor Mauritius himself. The imperial commands against the Donatists were being disregarded by carelessness and connivance. So it goes on to say, we got to figure out a way to stop all this. Old Rome basically saw the Christians of North Africa as a greater threat than the Eastern Empire in Constantinople. Now, what about today? Rome considers Christianity a threat, America a threat. If they don't destroy us in Christianity, they'll never get their way to what they were going after even back then, control and power, and what has been termed the Vatican-led New World Order, one world religion. That's what they're after. They've been after it for a very, very long time. Okay, we got about 5 minutes here. I don't want to go over. But let's look quickly, and I'm going to continue this because you can't, there's so much history here that I'll do another show on it. It might not be tomorrow because I have a planned guest, but the rise of Islam to destroy North African Christians. Now, it reminds me of the rise of ISIS to destroy the Western civilization and Christianity. But by the year 600, so this is an old story, folks, the Lord's congregation was triumphant over all her enemies. North Africa, comprising over 600 cities, was the richest part of the Roman Empire. The city of Rome itself was dependent on North Africa for daily bread. With the rise of Islam, Europe became permanently separated from the continent of Africa. Muhammad began his bloody career of conquest around the year 630. Beginning around 660, his successors conquered Egypt and later invaded North Africa. Millions and millions died by the sword of Islam, and the whole province became a wilderness. Isn't that what Joel just told us? But after conquering all of North Africa, the Arabs crossed into Spain in 711. Their main target in Spain was the Goths, who baptized by triune immersion and refused to join the Church of Rome. Interesting. They do the same thing today. The Arabs conquered all of the North Africa and destroyed true Christianity. In 711, they invaded Spain in order to destroy the Goths. The Arabs stayed in Spain until January 1492, when Portuguese Christopher Columbus was about to follow a map to the New World, as history tells us. The Moors surrendered to Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492 after occupying Spain for 781 years. The surrender of the Moors freed up the Spanish army for redeployment to the New World. This allowed for the redeployment in the Spanish army to the New World just in time to block the English, French, and Dutch colonization. Wow. Let's look quickly here, and then we'll have to end it and come back to this subject, because it all connects. The Vatican, how they connect, wrote the Quran, basically used Muhammad as the new prophet. And in 674, the Arabs lay siege to Constantinople. Only 50 years after the founding of Islam by Muhammad, a huge Arab army and navy attacked Constantinople. Conquering Constantinople required a huge number of ships, which you would not normally associate with desert dwellers. Constantine had a fantastic eye for terrain. Anybody attacking Constantinople would need a powerful land army and a well-equipped navy. The first besiegers were desert-dwelling Arabs. You know something? I think we have to stop there. Let me check the clock. Yeah, I've only got about a minute and a half, so let's stop there. There's so much in history that we're not told. I can remember studying American history, world history, in college. And boy, I tell you, I've always said this. After I really started understanding things and getting an opportunity to work as a journalist in Rome, and basically there I think my old self was dying, and I became a new person, just like I started the show off talking about. All of these things I learned in college were basically never getting to the heart of the truth at all. So I recommend that a lot of the things you can find when you really research history, put it together with the Roman Empire connected to the Vatican and all of their creations of religions, which I've gone over. You'll see there's a thread between it all. And when you see Vatican created Islam and Muhammad, it's not a far stretch. And let me tell you other things. I've found out a lot of other things on other religions they created over the years, and you'd be surprised when I did a series on how the Vatican created the Mormon religion and the Jesuits. That goes deep, deep. But anyway, we don't have time for that right now. Hope you enjoyed the show. I know a lot of historical stuff, but it's well worth it. And thanks for listening. Good show. Back tomorrow on the Investigative Journal.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.